I helped my lover escape from the imperial prison, only to be caught and dragged back by the man who had cancelled our engagement. I begged him to spare us, promising that in the next life, I would serve him like a beast of burden. He smiled cruelly. Yunyao, when you ask for something, you have to pay the price. That night, piece by piece, I stripped off my clothes and, in the end, he agreed to spare my lover's life. But by morning, he said to me, I thought you'd be better at serving people, but you're just SOSO. Yet later, he still killed my lover with his own hands. He said it was what I owed him, but I didn't care anymore because I was about to die too. I stood in the cold, dimly lit disciplinary room, the faint smell of blood from the instruments lingering in my nostrils. Lu Xingzhao sat above, draped in a black cloak, the heat from the charcoal fire rising around him. His cold eyes locked onto me and my father. Since we entered, he hadn't said a word. My father gave me a shove forward, smiling obsequiously at Lu Xingzhao. Esteemed nephew, this is your sister, Yunyao. It's been years since you last met her. Do you remember her? Lu Xingzhao turned his gaze toward me. So it's you, Yunyao. Indeed, it's been a long time. Seeing that he acknowledged me, my father felt a bit relieved, thinking that Lu Xingzhao had let go of past grudges against the Song family. What he didn't know was that I had met Lu Xingzhao just last night. Behind this disciplinary room was a small chamber with no windows, just a narrow bed. For the past 2 months, in the dead of night, I had been pleasing Lu Xingzhao on this very bed, keeping my lover, Xiamen, alive day after day. In fact, even now, the bruises he left on me last night were still visible. His revenge on the Song family began with me. My father thought today was our first reunion with Lu Xingzhao, but we had actually crossed paths earlier that summer. That day, I had sneaked out with Xiamen to buy some cold sweets from East Alley. Suddenly, a torrential downpour came, and Xiamen and I stood under a roof eaves, laughing about how unexpected the summer rain was. When I looked up, I saw Lu Xingzhao. He was on a tall horse, his dark golden cloak billowing, a black rain hat on his head, surrounded by the silent, menacing northern guard. The rain poured down relentlessly as he looked at me with cold eyes. I had no idea when he had arrived, or how long he had been watching me and Xiamen. It had been 4 years since we last met, and his presence was so sharp, it was suffocating. Instinctively, I called him brother, as I always had, but he turned his back and left without a word. Xiamen was surprised that I knew him, explaining that Lu Xingzhao was a supporter of the new emperor who had seized the throne, and after the new emperor ascended, he took control of the entire capital, Tiandu, with immense power. I didn't tell Xiamen that Lu Xingzhao and I had once been engaged as children and lived together for many years. That day, I watched Lu Xingzhao arrest many people, and the cries of women and children echoed through the East Alley, but he showed no mercy. Xiamen dragged me away until we were out of sight, and then he warned me, Yunyao, you need to stay away from him. He's not a good person. I nodded repeatedly, agreeing that Lu Xingzhao was terrifying. He was like a fierce beast, roaming the world alone, leaving no defenses for anyone in his path. After that day, I thought I would never see him again, believing he wouldn't remember me. I had heard the new emperor was planning to marry his own sister, a gentle and elegant princess, a noble lady I had the fortune of meeting once. As for me, I would marry Xiamen in the following spring when the azaleas bloomed and live a peaceful life with him, raising children and enjoying serenity. But the reunion that began that summer was destined to bring consequences in the fall. My father didn't receive Lu Xingzhao's approval, and slowly, he began to grow more fearful. He glared at me, signaling for me to speak up and beg Lu Xingzhao. Recently, the Song family had been implicated in a matter before the emperor, so my father had come to Lu Xingzhao in advance to build a relationship. If we didn't, and if we were sent to the imperial prison, the entire family of over 400 people would have no chance of survival. I stiffly bowed to Lu Xingzhao. Please, Lord Lu, come with us to celebrate the new year. We've prepared food and warmed wine at home. Lu Xingzhao finally moved, smiling. Since Uncle Song and Yunyao have braved the snow to visit, I'll gladly accept your invitation." My father sighed in relief and gave me a grateful look. The snow fell heavily as Lu Xingzhao held an oil umbrella, leading the way, the occasional snowflake landing on the braids woven with golden threads in his hair. I kept my head lowered, following behind him. As we passed the prison guardhouse, I couldn't help but glance over. Xie Min was locked inside now. Although he was quick-witted, he was extremely sensitive to the cold. On such a cold day, I didn't know if he could last until the azaleas bloomed in the spring. Last night, Lu Xingzhao had promised to let me see Xie Min today, but my father insisted I accompany him to bring Lu Xingzhao home to celebrate the new year, so I had to delay. Suddenly, Lu Xingzhao stopped, and I bumped into him unprepared. My father immediately scolded me in a tense voice, but quickly realized it was inappropriate to scold me in front of Lu Xingzhao. He softened his tone, telling me to watch where I was going. Lu Xingzhao glanced at me indifferently. "What's the matter? Don't you remember the way?" I clenched my hands tightly in my sleeves. Of course, I remembered. After coming and going these past 2 months, how could I forget? He asked me knowingly, right in front of my father. 3. The arrival of Lu Xingzhao brought great joy to the Song family. They crowded around him, praising how accomplished he was at such a young age and envying the favor he enjoyed from the emperor. Even I was treated with kindness. They had completely forgotten the days when they used to treat Lu Xingzhao as a servant many years ago. Lu Xingzhao seemed indifferent to the past, drinking with them glass after glass, and I couldn't tell what he was thinking. I've never been able to read his mind. It was the same when I first met him 10 years ago, the same when we were in bed together, and it was the same now. 10 years ago, the Lu family was ambushed by enemy troops on the border, suffering heavy casualties, including the deaths of Lu Xingzhao's grandfather and father. The late emperor was furious and held the Lu family accountable, removing officials and executing others. The Lu family soon lost power and their lives became extremely difficult. Because I had an engagement with Lu Xingzhao, his mother brought him to seek refuge with our Song family. It was snowing heavily that day, and his mother gently took my hand and said to him, "Xingzhao, this is your future wife. From now on, you must protect her for life." That year, Lu Xingzhao and I were both 10 years old. I was still a round, soft child, while he had already grown tall and handsome, the kind of beauty that made it hard to look away. I curiously watched him in the corridor where the snow was blowing, but he stared down silently, unresponsive. After the Lantern Festival, his mother drowned herself in a river. My mother said she died for love. My mother wept bitterly. They were close friends, sisters in arms. I cried too, but Lu Xingzhao didn't shed a single tear. People around said he had a cold heart and was a born loner, a star that brought misfortune. After his mother died, my father, against my mother's wishes, broke off my engagement to Lu Xingzhao. But for the sake of his reputation, my father did not drive Lu Xingzhao away. Instead, he kept him in the Song household, saying he would raise him, help him find a wife, and establish himself. But in reality, my father never did that. While my mother was alive, she still protected Lu Xingzhao, but after her death, he was gradually treated as a servant, forced to do all the dirty and tiring jobs without enough food or proper clothing. I secretly gave him food and clothes, but he always rejected them, throwing them away in front of me. "I don't need your pity," he said coldly. "I'm not pitying you," I retorted angrily. "Then why are you giving me these?" "It was my mother's request. When she passed away, she asked me to treat you like a brother, and I promised her I would." "Brother?" He stared at me, his gaze scanning my face as though searching for an answer. "You treat me like your other brothers?" I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I thought of him the same way, but I nodded anyway. He suddenly gripped my shoulder tightly, his voice cold and harsh. "I'm not staying here to be your brother." That was the first time I saw him lose control like that. He had always been as calm and aloof as a white crane, never showing his emotions. His expression scared me, and I tried to push him away, wanting to escape. But he was so strong, I couldn't break free. I couldn't stop crying, and he slowly loosened his grip, reaching up to wipe away my tears. Then, he lowered his head and kissed my lips. His lips were cold but intense. I was lost, not knowing what to do, when my father suddenly barged in. He hung Lu Xingzhao from a tree, beating him mercilessly with a whip, cursing him for being delusional and ungrateful. Lu Xingzhao's clothes were stained red with blood, but he didn't utter a word, only watching me. I watched him from afar, not pleading for him. I knew my father's temperament. If I begged, he would only punish Lu Xingzhao more. So I went back to my room. The next day, I heard from a servant that Lu Xingzhao had disappeared and my father hadn't made any effort to look for him. Later, I secretly searched for him and found that he had become a servant to the emperor, who was still a sickly prince at the time. My father said that Lu Xingzhao must have already befriended the prince and was trying to restore his family's name, but unfortunately, he had chosen the weakest prince to follow, so he would never amount to anything in life. That year, we were both 16, and according to the agreement made by our grandfathers after the new year, Lu Xingzhao and I were supposed to marry. 4. Lu Xingzhao was somewhat drunk. My father had asked him to stay the night at the Song residence, and he didn't refuse. My father gave him the best room in the house, and my stepmother called me aside, nervously telling me to go to Lu Xingzhao's room tonight. Less than a month after my mother's death, my father made my stepmother his official wife, and from then on, they became a family. Their children were already well married, while I remained unmarried. They once wanted me to marry a man who was my stepmother's nephew, a man who had countless concubines and loved to frequent brothels. My stepmother said it was a way to strengthen the family ties, and my father didn't object. But just before I was to marry, the man suddenly drowned in a drunken stupor. My stepmother cursed me, calling me unlucky, saying I brought misfortune to men. Since then, no one dared to propose to me, until Xie Min appeared. Yunyang, you and Lu Darren should be husband and wife, so it won't be considered disrespectful. If you can have Lu Darren's child, our family will have a future, my stepmother said warmly, holding my hand. No one in the Song family knew that I was already Lu Xingzhao's plaything, and they thought I could still use my connections to please him. I didn't respond. She thought I was unwilling, so her smile faded, and she said, Yunyang, you don't need to be so reserved. If the Song family is in trouble, do you think you can survive alone? I sneered. You're wrong. My reserve was gone long ago, for years ago, on the night of the New Year. You've forgotten, haven't you? Then, I leaned closer to her and said, Don't worry. I will satisfy Lu Darren. Even if the Song family falls into trouble, I'll still survive on my own. My stepmother froze. Perhaps she never expected that someone as obedient as me could speak so sharply.
5.
I went to Lu Xingzhao's room. He was drinking tea, showing no sign of being drunk. The mist from the tea surrounded his amber eyes, deep and unfathomable. He knew I was coming, and he was waiting for me. I closed the door and began to undress, as usual. But he seemed uninterested, his slender fingers holding the white porcelain teacup, his gaze fixed on the falling snow outside the window. I paused for a moment, then put my clothes back on, preparing to leave. Did I tell you to leave? He asked coldly. I stopped in my tracks and looked back at him. He was also looking at me. I sat beside him, making tea for him, but he continued drinking, still not touching me. The room was warm, and time passed quietly. Before I knew it, I fell asleep. I had a dream. I dreamt that day when I helped the assassin from the Xie family rescue Xie Min. Lu Xingzhao intercepted us, and he immediately recognized me, even though I had disguised myself. Xie Min clung to his leg, urging me to run, but he kicked him unconscious. He wanted to kill Xie Min, and I desperately blocked him, kneeling before him, calling him brother over and over, pleading with him to spare us. I promised that in the next life, I would be his servant. But I had forgotten. He didn't like me calling him brother. He slowly wiped the blood from the blade, smiling at me. Yunyang, when you beg, there is always a price to pay. He rarely smiled. When he did, it was both beautiful and cruel. I wasn't the naive child anymore. I understood the meaning of his words. So, I clung to him, trembling as I pressed myself against him. His smile faded, and his hand almost crushed my shoulder. He gritted his teeth. Very well. I didn't understand why I was doing what he wanted, yet he was angry. He hugged me, kicked open the heavy iron door, and threw me onto the stiff bed. That night, the darkness grew sharp teeth and bit at life, causing pain. When the morning came, I picked up the scattered clothes from the floor and covered my body. He slowly drank some water. I thought you would be better at serving, but it's just so. Yunyang, you need to try harder, or he won't live very long. At that moment, I knew he was no longer the brother I once thought. He was a man who harbored a desire for revenge and could tear apart all my dignity. 6. When I woke up from the dream, Lu Xingzhao was still sitting by the window, the tea cold for a long time. I'm sorry, I fell asleep. I apologized. I didn't know if I had said anything in my sleep for him to hear. He wasn't angry. Tomorrow, you can see him. I was surprised. This was the first time he had actively allowed me to see Xiamin. I didn't think much of it. As long as I could see Xiamin, that was enough. I nestled into his arms again, tilting my head to seek his lips. Although he usually didn't say anything, I knew he liked it when I was close to him like this. I had learned this over the past 2 months. But this time he turned his head away. What's wrong? Did I do something wrong? I asked gently. He stood up. It's nothing, it's getting late. You should rest. After saying that, he left without another word. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I appeared well-groomed, not making a poor impression. Could it be that in this house, which he hated, he just lost interest? Once Lu Xingzhao left, my father immediately asked my stepmother if I had been intimate with Lu Xingzhao. I shook my head. My father scolded me for being useless, saying I was just like my mother, dull and unable to serve anyone. My uncle sighed, but my stepmother looked pleased. She feared that if I caught Lu Xingzhao's eye, he would seek revenge on her in the future. I didn't care what they thought. I returned to my room and packed the winter clothes I had prepared for Xiamin. As soon as it was dawn, I went to the prison. Lu Xingzhao wasn't there. It was the first day of the year, and he had to participate in various rituals with the emperor and officials. He had his own mansion, the most luxurious one outside the palace, but he preferred to stay in the prison. When I saw Xiamin, I immediately shoved the winter clothes into his hands. He didn't seem cold, though, and didn't put them on right away. Instead, he looked at the bruises on my wrist and asked, You got hurt? I accidentally bumped into something. I smiled, urging him, Hurry and try on the clothes. I made them myself, stitch by stitch. Okay, he said, slowly putting on the clothes. They were a bit big. He had lost weight. I also brought him some food, and he ate slowly, one bite at a time. I watched him, thinking back to when we first met. It was on a spring day on a boat when I was pushed into the river by someone. I couldn't swim and struggled in the water. The siblings who had been playing with me pretended not to see me. I knew they really wanted me to die. That way, my mother's last traces would be erased. I sank into the darkness in despair, and when I opened my eyes again, someone was close, giving me life-saving breaths. It was Xiamin, who had saved me using a method he learned during his travels in the southern region. But because men and women shouldn't have close contact, his family had to come to propose marriage. I felt sorry for dragging him into this, but he laughed. Yunyang, I think it's fate. He stood under the springtime azaleas, bright and warm. I finally felt the beauty of life again. Xiamin finished eating, set down the bowl, and smiled at me. Today, Lu Xingzhao seems particularly merciful, allowing you to stay with me for so long. He thought it was long, but I felt it wasn't enough. I didn't want to talk about Lu Xingzhao in front of him, so I changed the topic. But he mentioned it again. Lu Xingzhao is truly as capable as the rumors say. He was able to suppress such a large prison break. Yunyang, you have a good brother. I was stunned. We've only just met. Can we not talk about others? He was silent for a moment, then agreed. However, we didn't have much time to talk, as the warden came to urge me to leave. I had no choice but to say goodbye. Hang on a little longer, you'll be out soon, and we can go see the azaleas on the spring mountain. He nodded. I turned to leave, but he called out to me again, Yunyang. I turned back to look at him. He smiled, his eyes as bright as when he was a boy. Be careful on the road. Don't hurt yourself again. I'll be heartbroken. I murmured in response. But that wasn't a promise. If getting hurt could make him survive, I would be willing to be covered in scars. 7. I still wanted to save Xiamen. Although I failed last time, Xiamen's words earlier reminded me. The fact that Lu Xingzhao was able to suppress such a large-scale jailbreak proves that he indeed has the ability to handle things flawlessly in front of the emperor. But if I expose it in front of the emperor, Lu Xingzhao would certainly not escape. I don't want to harm him. I just want to make a deal and part ways, each living our own lives. Before I could find him again, the rumored Princess Baoying, who was to be betrothed to him, found me first. It was the 5th day of the Lunar New Year, and the noble women and official wives of the court were summoned to the palace to meet the Empress Dowager. My stepmother, a concubine who had been promoted to wife, was not eligible to enter the palace, so I went with my eldest aunt. Our appearance drew many disapproving looks, as my father had cancelled my engagement twice, and our behavior of trying to rise above others naturally invited criticism. At lunch, I had no appetite. I could only eat a small piece of fish before feeling the urge to vomit. My eldest aunt frowned and asked, "What's wrong?" I took a sip of tea, suppressing the nausea. Maybe I caught a chill. When I looked up, I saw the dignified and beautiful Princess bowing coldly watching me. After lunch, I was called to a side hall by the princess. The snow had just stopped, and the weather was especially cold. Only the princess and I were in the palace, and I knelt on the ground while she looked down at me, asking, "On the night of the Lower Yuan festival, were you at the Jiayu prison?" I froze. So the princess already knew about that night. I didn't deny it. Yes. Then I saw her eyes filled with anger and sadness. But she quickly suppressed it and said to me, "A woman like you, who can only share the good times but not the hardships, is not worthy of him. I, Princess Baoying, tell you, don't dream of a future with Lu Xingzhao." I bowed deeply. I know I'm not worthy of Lu Xingzhao, but unfortunately, in my current situation, I can't just disappear from his sight. If your highness can help me, I swear I will never appear before you or Lu Xingzhao again. She thought for a moment. Help you? How can I help you? I asked her to help Xiamen escape, and in return, I would fake my death and leave Tiandu. If I don't help you, she asked. I placed my hand on my abdomen. If your highness refuses to help me, then I will be forced to use the child in my belly to force Lu Xingzhao into marriage. She looked at me with disgust. After a long silence, she finally nodded in agreement. I had lied to her. She had seen me vomiting, so I used that to my advantage. But she believed me. She, too, liked Lu Xingzhao so much so that even if she knew he was with another woman, she could pretend not to see it. We were, in fact, very similar. As I was leaving, she called me back, almost as if seeking confirmation. "Did you ever like him?" I thought for a moment. Your Highness, the person I liked was Xiamen.
8.
As I was leaving the palace, I ran into Lu Xingzhao. In the swirling snow, we locked eyes. He stood tall in his black clothes, looking like a pine tree in the snow. I couldn't see the expression in his eyes. The princess had just promised me that she would delay Lu Xingzhao and try to convince her emperor brother to spare Xiamen. As for me, I would return to the Song family, catch a contagious disease, then fake my death in a villa outside Song City. From then on, I would stay far from Tiandu and live the rest of my life with Xiamen. So, this moment was our last meeting. Beneath the silent, desolate palace walls, it felt as though time had stopped. Suddenly, Lu Xingzhao started walking toward me, but a palace servant came out and called for him. I recognized the servant as one of the princess's attendants. The servant whispered in his ear, and after a moment of contemplation, Lu Xingzhao turned and walked back toward the palace. "Let's go. You'll have plenty to see later," my eldest aunt urged. thinking I was reluctant to part with Lu Xingzhao. Once in the palanquin, I saw a letter inside. It was in Lu Xingzhao's handwriting, inviting me to his residence tonight. He had only ever invited me to Jiayu prison before. This was the first time he was asking me to his home. I slowly tore the letter to pieces, letting the scraps blow away in the wind and snow. 9. That night, I vomited again. The piece of fish I ate at lunch still tormented me. The next afternoon, my maid informed my father, and he sent someone to call a doctor. But I had already made myself look like my mother when she was ill, painting smallpox marks on my face. My mother had died of smallpox. It came on quickly and was contagious, with no cure. The Song family feared this disease the most, and my mother was eventually abandoned in a villa outside the city. 2 days later, she passed away, and her body was cremated. The doctor came, took one look at me, and was horrified. Smallpox had already spread in the city, so it was likely I had been infected. My father, who valued his life, cared little for using me to manipulate Lu Xingzhao. He ordered that I be sent to the villa outside the city immediately. He also ordered that news of my smallpox should not be spread, to avoid affecting the marriage prospects of the other sisters in the family. The people at the villa were terrified of being infected. They kept their distance from me, only delivering 1 meal a day and never asking after me again. This was exactly what I had anticipated. My mother had been treated the same way before her death. It was for the best. This way, I could escape more easily. I lay in the room where my mother had died, waiting for news from the princess. Late at night, I had a nightmare. I dreamed of my mother's face, covered with smallpox, saying to me, "Wan Yu, don't be afraid. I will always protect you." I dreamed of the hands that had reached into my blanket 3 years ago, like poisonous snakes. I dreamed of Lu Xingzhao, hanging from a tree, blood dripping from his forehead, his cold eyes staring at me. I woke up in a feverish sweat, vomiting again, but nothing came out. I got up to find some water and saw a piece of paper pushed through the crack in the door. It was a letter from Princess Baoying. She said the emperor, moved by Xie Min being the last bloodline of the Xie family, had pardoned him of the death sentence. He would be exiled to Yunmeng's in Zhongzhou in 3 days. Yunmeng's was my mother's homeland. I looked at the fire clock. It was almost dawn. Without hesitation, I overturned the candle and set the room on fire, then jumped out of the window. Once I ran out of the villa, I didn't hear any sounds of firefighting. They were just waiting for my death. I continued running toward the city gate, and after a while, I thought I heard someone calling my name. But when I turned back, the voice was gone, and all I saw was the raging fire illuminating the dark night.
10.
As soon as the city gates opened, I used the pass provided by the Xie family's dead soldiers to leave the city, then disguised myself as a man and headed towards Yunmeng's. Along the way, I overheard townsfolk discussing the fire at the manor. They said the fire was so intense that my body was burned to ashes. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was for the best. But then they added that Lu Xingzhao also went to that manor, wandering there for 2 days before leaving due to an imperial summons. As I listened to their conversation, I quietly ate my dry rations. This was the end between him and me. I walked on waiting. Finally, on the 7th day, I saw Xie Min. His hands were bound by ropes, and he wore the winter clothes I had given him that day. His figure was still frail. I looked at him with joy, but he walked past me without recognizing me, walking dazedly ahead. I thought it was because my disguise was too good, or perhaps he was saddened by hearing the news of my death. But it didn't matter. Once we reached Yunmeng's, I would restore my female appearance, and he would surely be overjoyed. We would settle by the marshes, with a house and children of our own. After days of traveling, my body grew weaker. I had no appetite, always feeling nauseous, and my complexion worsened. Luckily, we finally reached Yunmeng's in late February. I stood by the frozen marsh, closing my eyes and feeling the sharp wind blowing from the lake. I was free, or perhaps I thought I was free. I didn't expect that 3 months later, I would see Lu Xingzhao again. 11. After arriving in Yunmeng's, Xiamin was assigned to organize the town's records since he had studied. I used the silver I brought to rent a small courtyard in the town, and then sent someone to fetch him. I appeared before him in my female disguise. He looked at me in shock. Yunyang, how are you here? I couldn't help but embrace him and truthfully told him how I had escaped by feigning illness. Amen. We can live in peace from now on, I said, listening to his heartbeat. His heartbeat quickened. Yunyang, you shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have to suffer with me. I shook my head. I'm not afraid of hardship, and being with you is no hardship. He sighed and reached out to touch my face. We went to a tavern to eat. I ordered a lot of food to nourish him, and he also picked out a piece of plum meat for me, one I had loved before. But I vomited again, the world spinning. He gently patted my back, and I told him not to worry, that it might just be a case of adapting to the new environment, and I'd be fine in a few days. Yunyang, he started to speak, then stopped. What is it? I asked, looking at him. Nothing. Let's eat, he said, shifting his gaze and helping me sit down. After the meal, he walked me back to the courtyard and then began to head back. The sunset shone on the stone-paved alley and cast a soft glow on him. I wished he would stop and talk to me, for otherwise the coming night would be long and silent. To my surprise, he stopped and turned to look at me. Yunyang, our marriage is supposed to be on the 17th of next month, right? I nodded. He smiled. Then, let's hold the ceremony as planned, shall we? Though this was something I had longed for, I hesitated. I had already been with Lu Xingzhao. I didn't know how to explain it to Xiamin. Seeing my lack of response, Xiamin slowly walked toward me, his tall figure blocking the warm sunlight. Let's go ahead with the ceremony, shall we? His gaze was cold and restrained. For a moment, I almost saw another Lu Xingzhao in his eyes. But it was only for a moment, and that unsettling look disappeared. If I am no longer the Songwon you in your heart, would you still want to marry me? I asked him. He gently embraced me. No matter who you become, I still want you to be my wife. I inhaled the scent of ink on his clothes and slowly felt reassured. All right, then we'll go ahead with the ceremony next month. We stood there in the sunset for a long time until the moon rose over the willows. 12. Since Xiamin had to continue working on the town's records, I took charge of the wedding preparations. Xiamin said to keep it simple, which I agreed with. He had been escorted here and had no money. The silver I brought was limited, and since there were no relatives of my mother's side left here to help us, I had to manage the budget carefully. I gradually stopped vomiting. I assumed it was because I had adapted to the water and soil of Yunming's. Before I knew it, it was mid-March. The area was covered with tung flowers, white and purple, filling the air with vitality. My mother used to mention tung flowers. She said they symbolized the blossoming of love in Yunming's. Had it not been for my grandfather being reassigned to the capital, she would have wanted to stay in Yunming's for the rest of her life. There were tung trees in the capital too, but they were rare. Lu Xingzhao had once picked some and given them to me, but later, he took them back, saying they were meant for my mother, to ease her homesickness. At that time, I had chased him around the courtyard and finally tackled him to the ground, saying that once something was given to me, it was mine and he couldn't take it back. In the end, he blushed, and I had my way, while my mother smiled gently from the corridor. Sister, do you already have one? Neighbor Sister Zhou suddenly asked, pulling me back from my memories. I was puzzled. What do you mean, sister? Sister Zhou glanced at my belly and then at my face, smiling. The child, look at your face. You have the signs of pregnancy, and your belly's starting to show. My mind went blank as I hurried home. I examined myself in the mirror. I had gained a little weight and my period had been missing for almost 4 months. In the past, when I was weak, I had experienced similar symptoms, so I hadn't paid much attention. I touched my abdomen, which had started to slightly swell. Though I wanted to deny it, the vomiting over the past 2 months likely wasn't due to adapting to the new environment, but rather a sign of the pregnancy informing me. I took some silver and went out to see a doctor. Sure enough, I was pregnant, and the baby was almost 4 months along. My frail body had kept me from noticing it sooner. This child shouldn't have been conceived and couldn't stay. I asked the doctor to prepare abortion medicine, but he said he only treated people, not killed them. I planned to buy safflower myself and take care of it tomorrow before the wedding. Afterward, I would bring everything to an end. 13. The street was filled with many soldiers, and I overheard some of them speaking with the accent of Tiandu. Why had soldiers from Tiandu come here? I kept my head down as I walked ahead, and just before I reached the physician's office, I saw Xiamin. He was standing at the street corner with 4 or 5 men. They had fierce looks in their eyes, and weapons seemed to be concealed in their clothing, but they treated him with great respect. Now that Xiamin was a civil official and had no relatives in Yunming's, how had he come to associate with these men, and how had it happened? Xiamin noticed me too, and after saying a few words to the men, he walked toward me. "What are you doing here?" I replied, "I was planning to buy some sugar cakes for tomorrow."
Who were those people?
He calmly answered, "They were asking for directions. Let's go. I'll accompany you to buy them." A group of armored cavalry galloped past us, raising clouds of dust. The people nearby were talking about how the Prince of Jin from the south was dissatisfied with the current emperor's ascension and was plotting rebellion. These soldiers had been sent by Tiandu to solidify the defense of Yunming's. It seemed that this beautiful lakeside would soon be embroiled in war. But some people could escape, while others, like Xiamin and I, could not. My heart grew uneasy, and Xiamin tried to reassure me, saying that both the emperor and the Prince of Jin only wanted the imperial throne, and they wouldn't slaughter the common people, only causing casualties among the soldiers. But soldiers are people too. They are children of the world's parents, I muttered. Xiamin smiled lightly. "Yin Yang, things aren't calculated that way." I understood. To kill one is a crime. To kill thousands makes one a king. The ants in this world have no right to calculate. In the end, I didn't buy the red flowers. 14. When I woke up the next morning, there was a layer of snow on the ground, up to my ankles. Sister Zhou said, "March brings peach blossom snow, and April brings the headwind. This is the unique climate of Yunming's." I reached out and caught a snowflake. It was icy cold. When the auspicious time arrived, Xiamin and I worshipped heaven and earth and became husband and wife. Although we didn't have any relatives to celebrate with, our neighbors warmly congratulated us. We bowed to heaven and earth, then to our elders, and were about to bow to each other as husband and wife when I heard someone ask Xiamin, "Groom, why aren't you paying your respects?" Xiamin didn't answer, and the room fell silent. I heard heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Tap, tap, tap. Step by step, neither fast nor slow, and then they stopped right in front of me. Through the gap in my veil, I saw a pair of black boots, the surface of the boots embossed with dark golden and honeysuckle patterns. Honeysuckle was the family crest of the Liu family. I instinctively wanted to step back, but the next moment, my veil was lifted, and Liu Xingzhao's solemn face appeared before me. He seemed thinner, but his eyebrows and eyes were sharper, and there was snow on his cloak. I didn't know how he knew I was here. The neighbors all knelt on the ground, not daring to lift their heads. I felt guilty. If I had known this would happen, I never would have let them come. 15. I thought Liu Xingzhao would kill me. He had warned me after my failed escape from prison that if I tried again, he would end it himself. But he didn't draw his Yanjing knife. Instead, he coldly said, "Come with me." I retreated. "My lord, I'm married now. I want to be with my husband." He glanced at Xiamin. "The ceremony isn't complete. You're not husband and wife yet. Come with me." Before I could speak, Xiamin suddenly laughed. "Liu Xingzhao, do you think you can leave here today?" He laughed wildly, a look I had never seen before. Then he moved, pulling a long sword from under the table. More men, some of whom were the ones I had seen on the street yesterday, came in from outside the courtyard. The neighbors who had been kneeling suddenly sprang to their feet and slit the throats of the soldiers who had come with Liu Xingzhao. Even Sister Zhou, who had helped me dress, now held a dagger in her hand. It turned out this wedding was a trap to kill Liu Xingzhao. And I was the bait. The snow continued to fall, and the courtyard was thick with the smell of blood. I staggered, feeling a wave of sorrow as I looked at Xiamin.
But he didn't look at me.
He didn't kill Lu Xingzhao. Instead, he pressed the sword to my neck. Lu Xingzhao, drop your knife. You think you can use her to threaten me? Lu Xingzhao sneered. Xiamin pressed the sword against my neck, and the blade cut my skin. Warm blood began to flow down, and his voice whispered in my ear. If you don't care about her, you should at least care about the child in her belly. This is your bloodline. It turned out Xiamin knew everything. But how did he know? At what point did he find out? I thought about it. He must have seen the bruises on my wrists every time I went to see him in the prison. He wasn't the innocent young man I had thought. He knew I called Lu Xingzhao brother. He saw through Lu Xingzhao's feelings for me, and he guessed that I had offered myself to Lu Xingzhao to stay alive. That was why he told me not to kneel or bump into things, because he would be heartbroken. He knew I would continue helping him escape from prison because of that sentence. Later, when we were at the restaurant, he saw my morning sickness, so he proposed that we marry as planned. He sent someone to Tiandu to inform Lu Xingzhao of my whereabouts so that Lu Xingzhao would be able to come today. Warm blood trickled down my neck, and by the time it reached my chest, it had turned cold. Lu Xingzhao stopped smiling. His eyelashes fluttered, and his deep, dark gaze locked onto me. Maybe, like me, he hadn't expected Xiamin would truly hurt me. Or maybe he hated me. He hated that I had deceived him. He hated that even though I carried his blood, I refused to leave with him. He gritted his teeth. Let her go. This is between you and me. Xiamin replied coldly. I'll let her go, and I can even let her give birth to your Lu family's bloodline. But you have to do a few things. What things? Xiamin spoke each word with cruel precision. You will confess to the world that your master murdered his father and brother to seize the throne. Then, in front of the 180 lives of my Xie family, you will cut yourself into pieces and atone for your sins. Once, my clear and passionate young man had finally turned into a bloodthirsty beast under the weight of hatred. What if I don't agree? Lu Xingzhao asked. Xiamin laughed coldly. Then you'll die here, along with her and the child. This way, your Lu family's bloodline will be severed for good. I advise you to think carefully. Lu Xingzhao's face was torn between struggle and hesitation. Finally, he slowly placed his knife on the ground. Xiamin's men rushed forward and bound him tightly.
16.
Lu Xingzhao was taken away by Xiamin, and I was locked in a room, with Sister Zhou staying to watch over me. She helped me dress the wound on my neck, her expression somewhat apologetic. Young lady, don't blame us. We're all serving our respective masters. The young master didn't really mean to harm you. Once he has avenged himself, he'll treat you well. I listened numbly. Xiamin, he might not be able to take revenge after all. He understood so little about Lu Xingzhao. Lu Xingzhao would never yield to anyone for me, or an unborn child. He always had double plans. What happened earlier was just to buy time. Sister, please buy me some saffron, I said, looking out the window. Sister Zhou shook her head. No, the young master said the child mustn't be harmed. Don't do anything reckless, and I won't let you come to harm. She gave me some medicine, and I soon fell into a deep, drowsy sleep, unable to summon any strength. Sometimes I could feel Xiamin had come by. He touched the wound on my neck, and Sister Zhou told him he'd been too harsh that day, that it might leave a scar. Vaguely, I heard him ask her, will there be a future for me and her? I couldn't hear the rest. I slept for a long, long time, until I heard the cries of the whole city. Sister Zhou hurried in with others, trying to lift me and get me out. But when we reached the courtyard, the soldiers who had arrived drove their swords through their bodies. The soldiers from Tiandu surrounded the courtyard tightly, and one of the commanders ordered me to return to my room to rest. I was pushed back into the room, staring at the tongue blossoms falling outside. Spring was nearly over, and the days were getting longer. Lu Xingzhao came that night. I was having a nightmare, dreaming of that time when I fell into the water, and after Xiamin saved me, he didn't climb out. I watched helplessly as he sank to the bottom. I called out his name loudly, and when I woke up, I saw Lu Xingzhao sitting beside me, my face streaked with tears. He looked vigorous, like fresh spring wood, and smelled faintly of bath soap. He must have won spectacularly, hence having time and mood to freshen up. As the candle flickered, he reached out to wipe the tears from my face, half smiling. You really like him that much? Even in your dreams? I looked at him. I, too, had once dreamed of him. But he left without even saying goodbye. He had promised to protect me, but he never appeared when I was being hurt. That night, when I was 17, my stepmother's uncle sneaked into my room, his cold hand reaching under my blanket. I struggled and screamed, but my stepmother later said he had entered the wrong room, and my father slapped me for being shameless. The next day, the white-haired old man smiled at me at the door. I ran in fear to find Lu Xingzhao, and in the freezing cold, I saw him standing by the carriage. I wiped my tears and ran to him, but I saw Princess Baoying getting out of the carriage, and he smiled as he helped her down. He had never smiled at me like that. I always thought he couldn't smile, but it turned out he just wouldn't smile at me. I stopped in my tracks and watched as they laughed together and entered the palace. I turned and ran again, wanting to leave the city, to go to my mother's hometown. But I was caught by the family servants for lacking a pass and was locked in a small courtyard for a whole year. That year, my dreams were filled with cold snakes, and Lu Xingzhao was gone. 17. I propped myself up to sit. My belly had grown much larger, and moving around was becoming difficult. Where's Xiamen? I asked. He's dead, he replied casually, adding, I killed him with my own hands. So the dream earlier had been real. His fingers brushed my lips. Why no reaction? Didn't you like him? I said nothing. His hand slowly slid down to rest on my belly. I heard you wanted to abort this child. I suggest you stop dreaming. Give birth to it properly. It's what you owe me. I didn't understand. How do I owe you? He smiled wickedly. You forgot? That night, when you begged me, you said everything you had belonged to me, including the child in your belly. I didn't remember, but I would give it to him. Fine, I'll have this child, I agreed. I had followed his words, but he seemed angry. He pulled me toward him, his lips coming close. I turned my head. Master Lu, I'm pregnant and unable to serve you. You should find someone else. His breath stopped at my lips, then he slowly released me. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he said nothing and got up to leave. I knew that though he hated me, he wouldn't force himself on me at this time. I just wanted to make him uncomfortable. 18. The day we returned to Tiandu, I saw Xiamen. The king of Jin thought Lu Xingzhao had fallen into the trap and could be easily disposed of, not knowing that behind him, the emperor was the real trap. Lu Xingzhao and the emperor's people worked together, and the rebellion was quickly suppressed. The king of Jin failed, and Xiamen couldn't escape either. His head was hung on the city wall for all to see. He never got his revenge. In this battlefield, the victor is the king, the loser is the bandit. I should have hated the man who used me and hurt me, but as I looked at his decaying face, I couldn't feel hatred. He was dead. I slowly lowered the curtain of the carriage, distancing myself from the fallen tongue blossoms of Yanming's. When we arrived in Tiandu, Lu Xingzhao didn't send me back to the Song family. After all, I had already been burned to death. In Tiandu, I had no name. He settled me in one of his villas, waiting for the child to be born. Since he had contributed to the pacification, the emperor valued him, and he had many duties to attend to. He only came at night. It was like we had returned to the old days when we only met at night. Because I was pregnant, the night no longer bore teeth, but instead became vines that tightly wrapped around me, taking my breath away. I often slept like this, and sometimes I would dream of Xiamen. He wouldn't speak, only standing beneath the rhododendron flowers, gazing at me gently. I called his name, asking if he had seen my mother. He didn't answer my question, only kept saying, Yunyang, I'm sorry. The next day, Lu Xingzhao threatened me, saying that if I dreamed of Xiamen again while near him, he would crush his bones to ashes. After that day, Xiamen never came to my dreams again. 19.
Time passed day by day.
In August, I gave birth to a baby boy. Lu Xingzhao was overjoyed and named him Junyao. The servant said that Lu Xingzhao was planning to find an official family to adopt me as their daughter so that I could marry into the Lu family from there. I chuckled when I heard this, thinking it couldn't possibly be true. After all, there was still Princess Baoying. A princess and her consort are supposed to remain loyal to one another for life. The consort cannot take concubines. Even if the princess showed mercy and allowed me to serve him, it wouldn't be possible. I was dying. Ever since giving birth to Junyao, my health had deteriorated. The doctor diagnosed it as postpartum hemorrhage, a condition caused by the hardships I endured during pregnancy. He said I was lucky to have lasted this long before the symptoms appeared, attributing it to the mercy of the underworld king. I gave the doctor some silver to keep it a secret and made him promise not to tell anyone. He also advised me to rest and avoid any intimacy, suggesting that might help me live a few more months. Now, 3 months after my confinement period, Lu Xingzhao hadn't touched me. Perhaps he had grown tired of me. Or perhaps he had found someone new. This villa, though large, suffocated me as much as the courtyard where the Song family had once imprisoned me. I had thought about escaping again. Rebellion seemed ingrained in me. But since the underworld king was unwilling, I decided to let it go. Besides, I missed my mother. Before she passed, she promised she wouldn't reincarnate too soon and would watch over me until I found a good place to belong. I wondered if she had kept her promise, or if she was still waiting on the bridge of helplessness, refusing to move forward. But I thought it more likely that she had lost her battle with the black and white envoys, forced to drink Meng Po's soup, and forgotten me. Otherwise, how could someone who loved me so deeply bear to see me suffer so much?
20.
When Junyao was 5 months old, Princess Baoying came. I hadn't gotten out of bed yet. Because the envoys from Western Liang were visiting Great Zhou, the emperor had sent Lu Xingzhao to receive them. He wouldn't return for several days, so he had spent the previous night lingering in my room, leaving only in the morning. The princess played with Junyao for a while before instructing the maids to take him out. Then only the two of us remained in the room. "I envy you," she said, looking at me. "You can sleep freely without worries." She then took out a small bottle and placed it in front of me. "What is this?" I asked. "Jequirity seeds." 1 bowl of jequirity seeds, tears in a lover's eyes. The name sounded poetic, but it was a poison. Taken daily for about 10 days, it would paralyze the body and lead to death, making it look like a sudden illness. Seeing my silence, she continued, "You might not know this while staying in this villa, but word has spread outside. People know you are Song Wanyu, and they know you once eloped with Xiemin. Xiemin was a rebel. Lu Xingzhao may marry any woman he wishes, but he absolutely cannot marry the woman of a traitor. The emperor has decided to give you a dignified death. Your child will live on, well cared for." So it was the emperor who wanted me dead. I nodded. His Majesty worries too much. Lu Xingzhao would never marry me anyway. Besides, isn't he going to become your consort? The princess looked at the ligustrum tree in the courtyard. He won't be my consort. The consorts of Great Zhou cannot hold official positions, and His Majesty still needs him. Besides, he is not the kind of man content with a life of idleness. And I am to marry into Western Liang. For the past 10 years, Great Zhou had been too weak to maintain its position, so they had resorted to sending princesses to neighboring nations for peace. I hadn't expected that even the emperor's only sister could not escape this fate. It seemed that no matter their status, be it noble princesses or ordinary women, every woman in this world had her own burdens to bear. I thought she was pitiable. None of the princesses sent to marry abroad had ever returned. They all died in foreign lands. She noticed my thoughts. "You don't need to pity me. Pity yourself first. You only have a month to live, while I still have a long, long life ahead of me." Finally, she plucked a branch from the ligustrum tree and placed it in her sachet, saying there were no such trees in Western Liang, and she feared she might never see one again. After she left, the servants brought Junyao back. He stretched out his tiny arms, fussing to be held. I rarely held him. Unlike other mothers, I didn't feel an intense, heartfelt love for him. He wasn't the child I had hoped for. Still, I picked him up. He was warm and soft, a tiny, adorable bundle. I held him close and felt his small hands and feet. When he grew up, he wouldn't remember me. He wouldn't feel sorrow or longing for me. That was a good thing. 21. 10 days later, Lu Xingzhao came. I had been asleep, but woke to hear his voice in Junyao room. I got up quietly and walked over. I saw him standing by Junyao's bed, speaking to the sleeping child. He said that if the Lu family army were still here, Great Zhou would never have suffered the humiliation of sending a princess away in marriage. He said he had helped the current emperor kill his father and seize the throne because the late emperor truly deserved to die. Even if it meant going to hell someday, he had no regrets. He said he would eventually unearth the Xie family and grind their bones to dust because they had devised the plan to annihilate the Lu family army. His father, brothers, clan, and tens of thousands of soldiers hadn't died on the battlefield but had been betrayed and killed by their own people. Their souls still couldn't return home. Tears fell from his face, like beads of a broken string. He was truly grieving. Then he noticed me and turned, his eyes fierce. He hated the Song family, hated me, hated the torment and humiliation we had caused him. He staggered toward me, the strong smell of alcohol on him. "Why didn't you save me?"
Why? He demanded.
He must have been drunk, talking nonsense. A man as capable as him wouldn't need my help. But he stubbornly insisted on an answer. "I saw you standing in the corner. If you had taken even one step forward, it wouldn't have hurt as much. Why didn't you come out?" Tears still streamed down his face, his voice as aggrieved as a child's. I froze. I finally realized who he was. He was the 17-year-old boy who had been tied to a tree and beaten. In my dreams, I always saw his cold gaze. But it wasn't his eyes that were cold. It was his heart. He had always stood firmly by my side, yet I had never taken a step toward him. Not even one small step. We had both been young, and we had both misunderstood. "I'm sorry." I apologized to the 17-year-old Lu Xingzhao. He looked at me, the hostility in his eyes fading, leaving only clear, bright tears. Finally, he collapsed into my arms and fell into a deep sleep. 22. The next morning, when I woke up, Lu Xingzhao had already bathed and was getting dressed. "Are you heading out again?" asked as I got up and helped him straighten his clothing. He paused, lowered his gaze, and stared at me for a moment before suddenly picking me up and carrying me back to the bed. He didn't seem to remember what happened the night before. The man in front of me now was the Lu Xingzhao that everyone feared and hated. But I wasn't afraid of him anymore. In the soft morning light, I embraced him, kissed him back, and used that moment as my farewell to the 17-year-old Lu Xingzhao. "What's gotten into you today?" He frowned slightly, sensing something was off. "Are you trying to plead for the Song family?" I'd heard that he was planning to investigate the Song family next. "No," I replied. "Good," he said coldly. "They deserve their fate, and so do you." With that, he buried his face in my neck, his bites sharp and relentless. We were entangled together until his attendants came calling for him several times. Only then did he finally get up. Before leaving, he casually mentioned, "Next month, you won't be staying here anymore. Have your things and Junyao's essentials packed." Drowsily, I murmured an acknowledgement, but didn't ask where we were moving. At that moment, Junyao, who was in the neighboring room, suddenly began crying loudly. Lu Xingzhao ordered the wet nurse to take him away so I wouldn't be disturbed. I glanced at Junyao, who was twisting his tiny body and reaching his little hands toward me. But I was so tired. I thought I'd wait until I'd rested to spend time with him. As Lu Xingzhao was about to step out, he suddenly returned. Leaning close to my ear, he said, "Forget about packing. The house has everything you need. If anything is missing, we can add it later." Finally, he said, "Wan Yu, wait for me to come back for you." 23. They all left one after another, and the world gradually quieted down. After a while, the door creaked open again. Someone entered the room. The footsteps were soft and gentle. The person sat beside me and lightly fanned me. Thinking it was a maid, I opened my eyes and saw my mother. She no longer bore the disfigurement of her illness, nor the weariness of her years in the inner residence. She gazed at me lovingly, her voice calm and serene. "You're awake." Then she said, "Yunyang, I've decided to divorce your father. I want to return to Yunming's. The sky and land there are vast and free. Come with me, won't you?" I remembered that when I was 7 years old, my mother had said the same thing. But at the time, I was afraid of my parents separating, afraid of going somewhere unfamiliar, and I cried and begged her not to go. My mother, who loved me more than anything, was bound by her child for her entire life, until her death. This time, I wouldn't hold her back. I sat up immediately. "All right, Mother, let's go together. But is it too late now?" Mother smiled. "How could it ever be too late? Once you've made up your mind, it's never too late." She helped me dress and comb my hair, then held my hand and led me outside. A large boat was docked in the courtyard. I leapt aboard, and in the blink of an eye, I was sailing across the great marshlands. A speck of dust holds 3,000 worlds. A fleeting moment spans 8,000 springs. I nestled into my mother's embrace, closed my eyes, and felt the wind, the mist, and freedom. 24. Princess Baoying's Perspective, Extra. In the 3rd year of my marriage alliance, I finally received a letter from the great Zhou. The letter said that for the past 3 years, Zhou had enjoyed favorable weather, good governance, and prosperity. My brother the emperor now had 2 sons and a daughter. It mentioned that after Song Wanyu's death, Lu Xingzhao requested to be stationed at the northern frontier the following year. My brother did not try to dissuade him and allowed him to leave with his child. Before his departure, Lu Xingzhao had nearly obliterated the Song family. Song Wanyu's stepmother was killed by him. I remembered that he had also killed the stepmother's uncle and nephew. He was meticulous, leaving no trace of evidence behind. But I thought, if he had left evidence and let Song Wanyu know, perhaps their ending would have been different. As for Song Wanyu's cause of death, the letter stated it was from blood collapse. I stared at those words for a long time, realizing that when I visited her back then, she was already living on borrowed time. Yet she never mentioned it. Had I known, I wouldn't have given her the rosary P.
She must have been so heartbroken back then.
She was already a dying woman, and I still said such cruel things to her. I once hated her and envied her, but at some point, I let go of those feelings. I looked at the moon above the western Liang skies. Its light fell coldly over the Chinese privet trees. I had thought western Liang was barren without privet trees, but I was wrong. They were everywhere, growing even stronger than in Zhou. She was right. I truly was a pitiable person.
Even more pitiable than she was.
In the 20th year of my marriage alliance, western Liang was defeated, and I was finally returning home. The person sent to escort me was a young general in his early 20s, the one who had led the army that defeated western Liang. His name was Lu Junyao. He was the son of Lu Xingzhao and Song Wanyu, a strikingly handsome young man. "I held you when you were little," I said to him with a smile. He laughed heartily, appearing far more carefree than his father. "Where's your father?" I asked. He replied, "Father's health has deteriorated greatly. He has requested to retire and live in peace in Yunming's." Yunming's, yes, that was where he belonged. "And your mother? Was she kind to you?" "My mother passed away long ago, and my father never remarried, so he never knew the feeling of a mother's love." "I see," I said, asking no more. I adjusted the white hair framing my temples and climbed into the carriage sent to bring me home. At last, I too was going home.